Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's been 22 weeks of the Black, and now it's time to find out how it all ends. But, does it? In October, the second book in the series, The Black Arrival, will begin its podcast run on YouTube and the Shadow Publications feed. That book will run for 23 to 27 weeks and should, I say should, be immediately followed by the third book in the series, Outbreak. Joe Hempel will be back on narration duties, and I, your MC, have even more content to bestow upon you. Starting next Friday, I'll be bringing back my first full-length novel, Closet Treats, with my original narration to the podcast. It hasn't seen the world since 2012, so this should be a nightmare-inducing trip down amnesia lane for me. That novel should tide you over until October, when The Black Arrival begins its run. That said, Closet Treats is psychological horror and might disturb some listeners. But wait, I have other stuff too. Neptune Scars, the first book of a new Soul and Beyond trilogy, will start podcasting in fourth quarter as well. And how about that Ancient Trap thing? When does that start? In short, I have a wealth of stories to keep you occupied and entertained. But that's for the future. Let's return to now, where the occupants of Leaguer are currently having one hell of a bad day. Thanks for listening to The Black and for all the support. I hope you enjoyed. You can best support the podcast by buying books. Period. End of story. But if you want to use Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-Fi to extend your support and get access to exclusive content, please feel free. Links are in the show notes. With that, be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 22, the finale of The Black.
Life jackets, lifeboats, safety tethers, prayers. That was the priority list Vrabel had given the remaining crew. Calhoun didn't know what the creature below the ocean floor would do when the shots went off. Hell, none of them did. But it was a fair bet it wouldn't be happy about it. Once the shots were loaded, the team poured as much concrete casing down the pipes as they could. The casing would provide a backstop for the shots and hopefully increase the downward thrust of the explosion. If, that was, the blast didn't just blow the drill string apart. Red emergency lights marked paths to the lifeboats. Everyone, including Catfish, wore a life jacket. As for the safety tethers, Bill and another roughneck were still setting them up. Catfish and Shauna had taken out one of the Zodiacs to drop the AUVs. They were towing AUV-5 and AUV-1 out of the rig's shadow. They were the first two robots to fully charge. Catfish had performed his surgery on them and hooked up the strips of magnesium to the scoops. Calhoun had only planned to dissect 5 flares, but after Catfish had told him how the flame burned and that there was no guarantee the lighting mechanism would work on both AUVs, he decided to pillage the rest of the flares from the lifeboats. He and Vrabel had torn out over 30 of them and extracted the magnesium from the red flare's casing. When that was done, Calhoun felt like his fingers were going to fall off. But if it worked, it would be well worth the pain. When Shauna and Catfish returned, they'd begin the countdown. Catfish had programmed the AUVs for a swift descent. It would still take them at least half an hour to reach the ocean floor. Before they passed into lower midnight, they'd squirt status data to the string. Based on their velocity, the robots would forecast their arrival at the planned coordinates. Calhoun wished he had a cigar. Just one last cigar and maybe a nice snifter of Highland Park 18. His mouth watered at the thought. He glanced at the drill table. The drill crew was taking a break beneath the derrick. The falling rain barely touched them, but the wind gusts tore at their clothing and hard hats. OCD to the last, Vrabel had insisted everyone wear hard hats in their safety gear. Calhoun thought the rig chief was making one last effort to protect his men. Laudable, but unnecessary. If Calhoun was right about the thing living beneath the ocean floor, he had little doubt it was going to rock the rig into the water. They'd all be lucky to live another 2 hours. The Zodiac skipped across the waves. Shauna had strapped herself into a safety harness, and, for the first time in his life, Catfish had too. He'd never run a boat in this kind of weather. JP usually did the honors regardless of the size of the waves. Shauna had tended the boat while he'd dropped into the cold water to perform a last spot check on the AUVs. He untethered each of them from the tow lines and then lingered. AUV-5, the dunce, and its well-behaved brother were going to their doom. The robots didn't know it, but they were hopefully going to save everyone on the rig. Well, the 9 that were left anyway. Catfish had chuckled to himself behind his mask as he opened 5's status panel and made sure all the lights were green. Maybe you'll save the whole world. Satisfied his babies were ready for their mission, he closed the panels and patted their hulls. Swim well, and go kill that fucking thing, he thought. He swam to the side of the boat and waved a hand. Shauna must have seen him and hit the remote because a second later AUV-5's screws began turning, the sound of its engine a quiet hum. The ballast pumps took on water and a few seconds later it disappeared from sight. AUV-1 followed close behind. A wave crashed over him, but Catfish didn't care. The cold, the fear, he'd left it all behind. All that mattered now was seeing this through. At least now they had a chance. Driving the Zodiac back to Liger took far too much patience. He wanted to be on his laptop to monitor his robot's progress as they reached lower midnight. Not for the first time he wished he could ride with them to the ocean floor, see the fish up close and watch as the world turned into darkness that not even deep space could match. Catfish slowed the boat. The rig was lit up like a Christmas tree. Atop the bridge, red LEDs glowed and blinked. The oil derrick had green lights near its bottom, yellow lights up its middle, and the upper section was all red. From out in the ocean, he'd even been able to see the work lights on the deck. Shauna turned her head, hair a mess of salty moisture. We there yet? She asked with a smile. He grunted as he motored to the mooring. The bright bay halogens dissipated the shadows, and he let out a sigh of relief. Returning to the rig was both terrifying and comforting. At least he knew what was on the rig. In the water? Impossible to know if one of those things was waiting for someone to fall in. The white nylon line hung from the wall. Catfish wrapped it tight around the boat's cleat. Okay, Shauna. Let's... She hissed at him. Catfish turned and looked at her. Her jaw was stiff, cheeks hollowed, and her eyes fixed on something above his shoulders. He raised his eyebrows at her, but he already had a damned good idea of what she was looking at. Slowly, he moved a hand to the flashlight clipped to his wetsuit. She nodded to him, and did the same. Light in hand, he flicked its switch and turned as fast as he could. The light jumped up the superstructure wall. It sat perched on a piece of gleaming steel. Its eye stalk shuddered as he pointed his light at it. Even with the sound of the waves and the howling wind, he heard the sizzling. The thing flowed to the other side of the steel beam. Go, go! He yelled at Shauna. She dropped her harness and climbed up the boat launch. Catfish kept his eyes focused on the beam and played his light over its surface. The entire beam was clean and shined as though polished. Another light joined his. Get up here, damn it, she said. He didn't wait to be told twice. He backed away and climbed up to join Shauna, her light searching the steel beam as his had. If you need anything from the AUV bay, she said, you better get it right now. Catfish shook his head. Let's get to the deck and shut this thing in here. What if it gets in the water? She asked. What will it do? He shrugged. No idea. But we can't kill it if we can't find it, and I'd rather it not find us first. She nodded. Okay, let's move. As they headed up the stairs to the rig deck, he was reminded of the trip into the superstructure. Clusterfuck. Everything was turning into one today. He reached the top of the deck and his light fluttered as he found his footing. Something down in the bay moved. He turned his light. The thing crouched on AUV-3 just behind its yellow fin. Yeah, you stay right there, he said to it. He gave it one last blast of light before closing the bay doors behind him. Up on the deck, the roughnecks stood beneath the derrick, the portable halogen work lamps bathing them with white light. Off to the side, near the tool areas, Vrabel, Bill, and Calhoun stood talking. Calhoun noticed them and cast a glance their way. Catfish nodded to him as he slid the bolt through the bay lock. If that thing wanted to get up on deck, it'd find a way. But for now, at least, it was in the bay and trapped by all those halogen lights. At least, he hoped. He stifled another yawn. The urge to open his mouth and roar a long one was becoming impossible to rein in. The rig rocked slightly beneath the punishing waves. Sheets of rain fell from the sky. This far from the halogen deck lights, it was darker than he'd ever seen. Bill stood 10 meters from the superstructure. Some lights still worked on the first floor, but the second and third floors were dead. He wasn't even sure electricity was still working up there. Once they had finished loading the shots and casing the drill string, he'd taken up sentry duty. That was more than an hour ago. Keeping himself occupied and awake was becoming difficult, but every time he felt as though he'd fall asleep standing up, he thought of those things filling the hallways of the superstructure and being trapped in there with them. Just to be safe, he dumped the flashlight's batteries for fresh ones and taken another flashlight with him. The spare clipped to his belt waggled in the wind. The tight beam from his flashlight played over the steel door that led into the rig's superstructure. They'd already closed the other hatches. The creatures had no way to get out onto the deck, unless, of course, there was something they'd forgotten. Bill had been thinking about that for several minutes, but it felt more like hours. His mind raced over Leaguer's blueprints, trying to find a way for the things to get to the deck, and really, he couldn't think of any. He continued flashing the lights around the lower deck, trying to find any point of ingress. He was so tired and focused on doing just that, he never thought to look up. From the bridge windows, a continuous stream of black oozed down the metal and to the lip which he, Shauna, and Vrabel had used to escape. The viscous fluid pooled and waited. Eye stalks popped up out of the sludge and watched the deck crew. It took several moments for it to notice Bill. When it did, it began to move. The waves continued to grow on the ocean's surface. Wind whipped across them, spraying white froth. Jellyfish and man-o'-wars were caught in the continual advance of the storm surge. A pod of whales rose to the waves, took deep breaths, and headed back under for protection from the howling wind and rain. AUV-5 filmed every movement as it plummeted toward the ocean floor. AUV-1 following a few meters behind and doing the same. This depth of the ocean didn't notice the sun slipping below the horizon. Thanks to the storm, its rays hadn't penetrated far into the water all day. Darkness was all AUV-5's cameras picked up until it ran across a school of lanternfish. The ugly, alien-looking creatures had risen from lower midnight in a frenzy of self-protection. Something was wrong with their ocean floor home. Very wrong. As the robots swam deeper, the school broke apart in terror. They had seen the robots before and on some level knew they weren't a threat. But now everything was a potential predator. An ancient instinct born of millions of years of evolution told them to swim for their lives. AUV-5 caught pictures of them as they passed. Other creatures, more ancient than even the lanternfish, were leaving the ocean floor as well. Some would survive the journey to the upper depths. Others would explode when the pressure they'd lived with all their lives began to subside. But all of them were obeying the same basic instinct. Flee. AUV-5 circled the drill string as it descended in a lazy spiral. When it approached the 18K foot mark, the subroutine monitoring depth and pressure broke out of its sleep. AUV-5 sent a burst of data to the drill string. AUV-1 followed suit. The subroutine reset itself and waited for the depth to reach 27,320 feet. At 26,000 feet, it would begin monitoring for seismic disturbances. The robots continued their swim to the bottom in complete darkness. Their creator would have been proud of the spiral course in which they moved. As they made their way into lower midnight, there were no fish to be seen. No life at all. The only life left in the trench waited for them. The laptop beeped. Catfish had been staring at it for over half an hour as he tried to keep his stomach from rebelling. Vrabel filled the ballasts beyond the safety line to keep the rig stable, but the waves didn't seem to care. They kept coming, and each one battered the rig's aft section. He'd never even considered the damned rig could just plain sink before they had a chance to take care of business. That would be the final fuck you from the universe. He grinned as the display lit up with information. Pressure, depth, speed, coordinates. All the numbers seemed to dance before his eyes. He hit a button on the keyboard and the program started calculating averages. They appeared on the screen in neat rows. His children had done what they were told and were heading straight down. Catfish closed the laptop and shoved it into the waterproof satchel. Before he left his station, he dragged 3 fingers lovingly across its surface. That little computer had been his constant companion for the last year or so. But the satchel? Hell, he'd had that since he left school. It had been through a dozen laptops and other gadgets. And now, he would probably never use it again. Catfish blew out a sigh and ran out into the rain. A gust of wind hit him and he nearly slipped to the deck. Remembering how Aaron had broken his skull, he slowed his pace. Vrabel and Calhoun hunkered down below the tool storage roof. He looked at his watch. 22 minutes until they hit bottom, he yelled at Calhoun. Catfish pressed a few buttons on his diver's watch and it started a 25-minute countdown. That gives us 3 minutes of lull before we blow it. Calhoun looked up at him and grinned. He turned to Vrabel. We don't have much time. Vrabel rolled his eyes and pointed to the superstructure. Are you kidding? That's a fucking eternity for those things. Got that right, Shauna frowned. She glanced up at the superstructure. We don't have enough lights up there. The rig chief stood and held a hand above his eyes to knock out the glare from the work lamps. Bill's on duty, Shauna. We have nothing. Vrabel paused. What's wrong? Catfish asked. I don't see Bill. Or his light, Vrabel said. Shauna pulled the flare gun from her pocket. She had 2 spare rounds and 1 in the chamber. Calhoun turned on his light. Catfish pulled his from the wetsuit. With the rain pattering down atop them, he hadn't seen any reason to change out of it. Vrabel expertly kept his footing as he walked from the tool area and to the derrick. The roughnecks sat beneath it, a circle of work lamps around them. They looked spent and on the verge of collapse. Catfish watched as the rig chief said something to the crew. The men stood and pulled their lights. They had moved a few of the work lamps away from the drill table. Now it seemed it was time to put them back. He thought about running over there and helping, but a twinge in his back told him that was a bad idea. Struggling to get the AUVs into the water and all the running around hadn't exactly done his spine any good. Besides, the way he was tilting with the rig, he was afraid he'd drop one of the last halogens to the deck. Right now, they couldn't afford that. Catfish watched as the men moved the generator and the 4 remaining lights to cover the drill table and the controls. The group stood on alert now. Vrabel waved to Calhoun. Calhoun, head down against the wind and rain, carefully walked toward the derrick, Shauna and Catfish close behind. The rig rocked as another huge wave hit. Calhoun stumbled, but Catfish managed to steady him. No falling down, old man, he shouted above the din of the storm and machinery. The rig crew spread out, each manning a control station. Vrabel stood on a steel podium behind the drill table. Calhoun's remaining team met him there. The men already know how to do this, he shouted. But just in case, here's how you drop the drill. The 3 of them watched as he showed them how to work the controls. Piece of cake, Catfish thought. Unless the black has hold of you. He turned back to the superstructure. Something glowed near the front hatch. As he watched, the glow moved and then went out. Guys! They ignored him. He wrapped a hand on the control box and their voices went silent. I think I know what happened to Bill. In the dim glow spilling from the rig lights, they watched as the metal superstructure went from a gray to a gleaming silver. The black was coming down. All of it was coming down. Vrabel screamed at the men around the drill table. They raised their lights and pointed at the superstructure with shaking hands and knees. The distance was too great to do more than illuminate the wave of black that flowed to the deck. Tentacles and eye stalks waved at them as it slowly covered the distance from the edge of the superstructure and toward the pipe fittings. Catfish looked down at his watch. 15 minutes. They had to make it for another 15 minutes. Shauna? She stepped forward and stood next to him. Light it up. Not yet, she said. Not yet. Vrabel felt the warm tickle of urine jet into his underwear and stream down his leg. He would have been ashamed had he not been so terrified of what he saw. The thing wasn't just sliding toward them now, but bubbling and popping and lifting itself upward. The creature contracted into itself, consolidating its mass and finally transformed into a shape. Short, squat legs sprouted from its base. The liquid continued to climb up the makeshift limbs as it grew a wide torso. The eye stalks and tentacles slid across the surface as they met in its center. 5 legs, 7 arms, 9 eyes, and the goddamn thing was growing taller by the second. He heard none of the crackling and popping as it rearranged its internal structure to provide support. The ocean roared and another wave hit the rig's aft. Even with the ballast keeping the rig as close to the ocean as it could safely get, the rig bobbed up and down like a bath toy. He grabbed the control panel's edge to support himself as the rig took another shock. The thing trying to stand didn't waver. Vrabel opened his mouth to yell something and then closed it. What was there to say? What orders could you give when you were trapped on a football field-sized metal platform in the middle of the goddamned ocean? He finally managed to pluck a thought out of the chaos in his mind. "Go get the fucking lifeboats! Now!" he shouted at the remaining crew. The roughnecks didn't move. They were just as frozen as he had been. "God damn it, I said move!" Finally, one of them did. He broke rank from the drill table and ran toward the lifeboats. He made it halfway across the deck before a long tentacle of black swished out from the thing's solid form and took his feet out from under him. Jason Jones flipped in the air and then landed on his back. He had time to start a scream before the tentacle wrapped around his head and dragged him into the creature's center. Jones's body disappeared inside it. "Fuck!" Vrabel screamed. Calhoun's heart stopped, just for a second or two, but he felt it seize. The sight of the thing forming on the deck had been enough to freeze his brain and everything else along with it. Vrabel was screaming at it in obscenities. He shuffled behind Vrabel and searched the deck. There had to be something, anything they could use to slow it down and buy time. At this rate, it was going to be on them long before the AUVs could reach their target. Then he saw what he was looking for. "Vrabel!" The rig chief turned to him with wild eyes and shaking legs. "The gas for the generator! We need to light up the deck!" Vrabel blinked at him. Calhoun slapped him hard across the cheek. Vrabel recoiled, and then his eyes bore into the older man's. "The gas!" "Right," Vrabel said. "Right." He turned to the crew. "Get that barrel of diesel. We need to pour it across the deck. Make it come through the fire. Come on, move!" Vrabel and the 3 remaining crew ran to the orange and red barrels sitting by the tool area. Vrabel and one of the roughnecks walked a barrel toward the middle of the deck. The other pair of men did the same with the second barrel. The thing moved toward them. "Hurry!" Calhoun shouted. Vrabel tipped the barrel over. Diesel fuel poured out onto the deck in a thick stream. The other barrel tipped further down. Black tentacles surged toward them. For a moment, Calhoun thought the thing would drag them back, just as it had with Jones, but the tentacles ignored them and moved for the men. "Shoot it!" Calhoun yelled. Shauna took aim at one of the barrels and pulled the flare gun's trigger. The flare shot out of the gun with a bang and a puff of smoke. The deck turned red for an instant before the burning magnesium round struck the deck near the barrel of fuel. A line of fire rose from the deck's metal surface. The diesel fuel that hadn't slipped through the steel grates formed a flickering zigzag of flame. One of the creature's tentacles burst into bright licks of fire before flopping and splashing into burning liquid. Calhoun looked up at the creature. The burning remains of the tentacle were no longer attached to it. The thing had simply severed it. "Fuck me," Calhoun said. The diesel fuel would buy them a few minutes, but when it was done burning, they had nothing left to stop it but flares. There was nothing to see, unless it was through AUV-5's blue light cameras. It had reached its target coordinates, and now it was holding its position. From the imagery AUV-5 had taken of the tube worm beds around the spud site, Catfish had worked out a safe area for the AUVs to hover. While he'd been dead on with AUV-5, he'd been a little off on AUV-1's position. AUV-1 descended right on top of a tube worm bed. The tentacles wrapped around it like an octopus clutching a shell. Its metal skin slowly crumpled. A giant maw opened and then swallowed its metallic prey. AUV-5 noticed its brother's signal had disappeared and took note of when the signal ceased. The tentacles tried to reach it, but it was just a few feet out of their reach. AUV-5 was oblivious to their movements. The spud site was caked with a brownish sludge. Had Catfish been able to see through the cameras, he would have thought it was a scab. The trench topography had changed yet again. The valley walls were closer together, and a great hump had risen around the drill string. As AUV-5 sat in its position and waited, its seismic sensor registered a small tremor. It wasn't the signal it had been programmed to look for, but it took the sensor readings and filed them away. The ground beneath it moved. A cloud of rock and sand puffed out. The tube worms stopped waving their tentacles and instead stood still. The ground rumbled as something started to dig its way out of the rock. AUV-5's cameras finally noticed the movement and adjusted. If Catfish could have seen the monstrous eye that blinked below AUV-5, he would have screamed. Vrabel slid toward the control box. The rig rocked again as another wave crashed into it. Salt water sprayed over the crew and the fiery deck. The diesel fuel fire was fading fast. The thing knew it too. "Catfish!" Vrabel screamed. "It has to be now!" Catfish looked at his watch. He hoped like hell his babies were ready. "Hit it!" Lips moving in a silent prayer, Vrabel hit the switches. The drill table groaned as it loosed all its weight and began to turn. The robot couldn't feel the spider leg appendages that crawled over its surface. The robot couldn't see the giant divot in the ground beneath it. The AUV increased its propeller speed to remain stationary, but something was pulling it down. It was a mere meter from the thing below when the world shuddered as the drill string dropped and slammed into the ocean floor. The drill bit flew downward from the explosion. Tightly packed with concrete casing, there was nowhere for the force to go but down and out. The first joint of the drill string disintegrated into metal shards as the bit buried itself deep in the spud site. AUV-5 was suddenly free as the creature pulled back its appendages in great pain. The bit punched through rock and sand and buried itself deep in the creature's belly. The seismic sensors went off the charts and its two final routines kicked in. AUV-5's screws whined as it redlined its engines. The robot shot forward and down to the spud site. It crashed into the side, reversed, and then tried again until it made it inside the creature. Black sludge surrounded it. Its paint disappeared as the black burned its metal skin. AUV-5 kept its engines going until it made no further progress. The robot powered down its engines. The last command fired. Completely immersed in the flammable black, a solenoid clicked, and a gout of flame hit the magnesium strips. Impossibly bright light flashed inside the creature's belly, and then the world exploded. The drill table shook and rattled. Shauna stumbled forward and dropped to one knee. Catfish's AUVs had done their job, or at least she hoped so. The men were shouting to one another. She looked up and stared at the creature coming toward her. It was walking on those short, squat legs in slow steps. A large, jagged, amorphous mouth opened in its center. The rig shuddered as another wave broke over the aft section. More water hit the deck and extinguished the last of the flames. They were defenseless now, and the creature knew it. "Shauna!" Calhoun shouted. "Fire!" It shot out a tentacle that slammed into the deck, the ground trembling beneath her. She cocked the hammer on the flare gun. It was now or never. She aimed at the thing and pulled the trigger. A brief lightning jag of red illuminated the deck, and then the magnesium's 3,000-degree flame touched the black. The world turned into a huge ball of flame that billowed dark smoke into the sky. The creature's middle exploded into a yellow and orange wall of flames. The fire raced down its appendages with terrifying speed. The thing quickly lost cohesion and turned into a river of burning liquid. The burning black rushed across the deck in both directions. The sound of the rain pattering on the metal deck lost below the crackling and sizzling. Something exploded near the superstructure. 2/3 of the deck combusted. The shockwave knocked Shauna off her feet and she fell to the ground on her side. The flare gun slid from her limp hands. She rolled over and stared into the storming sky and the black smoke rising from the deck. The acrid air burned her lungs and she couldn't breathe. A body fell next to her. Ears ringing, vision blurry, she turned her head. Calhoun lay flat on his face against the deck. She tried to say his name, but the words died in her throat. Shauna groaned in pain as she tried to pick herself up. The roar of the fire might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Screams and shouts of men in pain and frantic panic barely registered. She managed to roll over and start a push-up. "Calhoun?" She tried to yell, but the word came out in a barely audible cough. She crawled to him and rolled him over. His eyes were unfocused and blood streamed from his forehead. His lips were moving, but she couldn't hear him. Someone grabbed her shoulders. Someone shouted at her to move. Someone dragged her toward a lifeboat. A tentacle flashed out and tried to reach them. Just before it could make contact, it burst into flame. The rig rocked again, but not from a wave. The entire port side lifted up out of the water as a massive bubble hit it. She hit the railing hard, but it brought her back to her senses. Catfish had her arm and was yelling at her. The lifeboat was in front of them. The sound of panicked screaming filled her ears. She turned. A human torch was running to the railing. She wasn't sure, but she thought it was Vrabel. The figure hit the railing and toppled over the side into the darkness. The deck canted to the other side, and suddenly she was looking down into the ocean. The growling waves and howling storm was lost to her as something hit her head, and the world went dark. When Shauna awoke, she was staring up at Catfish. Even in the darkness, she could see the gash in his forehead. His chin was on his chest, and he was snoring. A lightning bolt of pain lit her skull as she sat up. "Where am I?" she asked herself, and then it all rushed back to her. The rig, the deck, the black, Calhoun's motionless body staring up at a storming, lightning-filled sky. The lifeboat was large. Built for 10 survivors, it looked more like a fishing boat than an emergency vehicle. She dragged herself to one of the portholes and stared out at the ocean. Moonlight stared down through the gaps in the clouds, but there was nothing to see but waves and water. She had no idea where they were or where they were floating to. Something beeped inside the cabin. She was too tired to search for it. She knew what it was anyway, an emergency beacon. PPE would know where they were, and that meant everyone else would too. Shauna dragged Catfish's legs until he was lying down. She pushed him on his side, and he stopped snoring. In the darkness, with the fresh breath of salt air coming through a cracked porthole, she spooned against him and waited to see what happened next. In lower midnight, all is calm. There was no sound except for the echoing groan of the earth itself. The glowing greens and yellows of lanternfish or the phosphorescence of certain plants are the only light that penetrates the darkness. More than 5.6 miles from where the rig Leaguer once floated, there was a new trench. It was far deeper than its predecessor, and as irregularly shaped as the Boulder Flatirons. The explosion that created it left no trace of what had once lain beneath the ocean floor. The tsunami now headed for faraway land as the only evidence it had ever existed. A lanternfish descended into the new trench searching for food. Soon others joined it. Their new home was deeper. But to them, it was just as dark and life-sustaining as the old one.